Send summer out with a sizzle during the Omaha Steaks Labor Day sale. Save 50% site-wide on legendary steaks, juicy air-chilled chicken, beefy burgers, deli-style franks, and more. Plus, get an extra $35 off with code FALLFLAVOR at omahasteaks.com today. Don't wait. Save 50% site-wide on steaks and more during the Labor Day sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get an extra $35 off with code FALLFLAVOR. Minimum purchase may apply. See site for details.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. That's ziprecruiter.com/zip. ziprecruiter.com/zip.
A warmer from the low. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got yet another conference preview for you guys as today the Sun Belt gets some love. It's a little bit of a different looking conference than what we had for the Sun Belt the last few years, as we had a lot of conference realignment with this conference like 3-4 years ago, so not really changed from last year, but certainly it's a interesting conference, it's a fun conference, and one where you've got a lot of different styles of play. We're going to be taking a look at those and the betting trends here in the first segment. In segment number 2, Blake Lovell, he does such a great job over at Southeastern 16, looking at this great game of college basketball. He's going to be joining me. We're going to be looking at all 14 rosters. We're going to be looking at the coaching changes that have happened in this conference as well. And then in the final segment, I'm going to get you guys my projector or finish for the Sun Belt. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by Edge Boost. Edge Boost is making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever they want. With Edge Boost, 100% of gambling transactions do indeed get approved. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, put in that promo code of Greg, GREG. That'll get you a $1 for $1 match on your first deposit up to $25. And now let's take a look at a Sunbelt where you've got a lot of lower tempo teams in this conference, and you've got a lot of teams that they really struggle from 3-point range. Your fastest team in the conference last year was Georgia Southern. They're looking to crank things up a little bit as they've got a disciple of Nate Oates on the roster and on the coaching staff, and that's a big reason why. 40th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Actually halfway decent on defense as well, 181st in the country in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis. They need to be able to get that offense going a little bit more. I'll touch upon that in a minute, but certainly a team with a little bit of upside. Arkansas State does experience a coaching change with Brian Hodgson moving on over, but you have one former Alabama assistant taking over for another after Arkansas State was number 70 in terms of total possessions per game, but I don't anticipate that falling too much as Ryan Pannone, who is a part of that Alabama coaching staff, he is now going to be taking over the helm there, so that should be a lot of fun to be taking a look at. And then you sort of have some hodgepodge teams. You've got a few teams that are more towards the middle of all of college basketball in terms of total possessions per game, not necessarily playing super duper fast, not necessarily playing super duper slow, but you're going to notice there are a lot of teams that they really did not run a lot of tempo last year, as Coastal Carolina was certainly one of them, about 354th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Appalachian State, 355th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. Now, those are some pretty big outliers, but I mean, your average team in the Sun Belt is going to be playing a little bit slower rather than a little bit faster. For Texas State, year in and year out, this used to be a team that would be actually in like the bottom 50 in terms of total possessions per game. They sped things up a little bit, but they were still well outside the top 200 in terms of total possessions per game last last season. Georgia State is a team that's been playing a little bit faster ever since Jonas Hayes took over, but they're not necessarily a team that's going to be going harebrained and super duper up tempo. Old Dominion's always a relatively slow and controlled team, even with their coaching regime change from a few seasons ago to Mike Jones. You ask who, and I say Mike Jones, 254th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. So another team that's going to be looking to play relatively slowly. And for Scott Cross, he had this Troy team really doing a good job of generating turnovers, and that's another hallmark of this conference. They were 255th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. So a lot of teams hovering in that neighborhood of, I would say, about 225th to 300th in the country in terms of total possessions per game, and that was one of the hallmarks of this conference. You did have a lot of teams that were generating a lot of turnovers. South Alabama, another team that's outside the top 250 in terms of total possessions per game. They did a really good job of being able to generate turnovers, as they and Troy were two teams that tied for first in the regular season in terms of the just overall record, as you had four different teams go 13-5 within the conference last year. So that was obviously a lot of fun, to say the least. But that said, when it came to these two teams, they were very supreme in terms of being able to take away the ball and be able to generate turnovers. For Troy, in terms of turnovers forced on a per possession basis, they last year ranked 56th in all of college basketball. And then the aforementioned South Alabama Jaguars, they were number 28 in all of college basketball. So these two teams did a relatively solid job there. The Georgia schools were very much polar opposites. Georgia Southern, they were 102nd in the country here. Georgia State was 357th, and it's a big divide between the have and the have-nots, because there are some teams out there, like I just mentioned with Troy and South Alabama, they really look to generate turnovers. Appalachian State has never really been that team to generate a lot of turnovers. For as much as I love Justin Kern, if you need these guys to generate turnovers, they were 328th in all of college basketball. With that regard, Coastal Carolina, out of 364 teams, 364th. They generated a turnover on 9.8% of opponents' possessions at home last year. That was by far dead last in all of college basketball. So not a team that's going to be overly assertive. And then you have Louisiana Monroe's going through a little bit of a coaching regime change. They were more around about 353rd in all of college basketball last season. Louisiana was a team that was able to crank things up, 71st in the country, though they are experiencing a little bit of a coaching regime change as well. I did mention one of the hallmarks of this conference, not a lot of three-point shooting, to say the least, as you just go down the list. Appalachian State, they were about 167th in the country in terms of their three-point shooting, so right around about country average. That was one of your better teams. Georgia State, Georgia Southern was 143rd. Georgia State was 149th. These were actually two relatively solid teams in terms of three-point shooting. The team that represented the conference in the NCAA tournament, Troy, they shot 30.1% from three-point range. That was 341st in all of college basketball. Old Dominion was a team that picked up some steam late. They were 360th in all of college basketball in terms of their three-point shooting percentage. Coastal Carolina was a little bit of a, shall we say, hit-or-miss team last year. They were about 121st in the country with regards to their three-point shooting percentage, so they were able to put a little bit of something together late in the season. But you've had a lot of teams in this conference just really come up short with regards to their three-point shooting. Louisiana was 300th in the country with regards to their three-point shooting at 31.3%. Should possibly be a little bit better this year, but I wouldn't count on them being like leaps and bounds too much better this season as well. Arkansas State was 259th in the country with regards to their own three-point shooting percentage as well, so that was a little bit of an issue, and that's a big reason why you saw South Alabama play the style that they did under Richie Riley. Like, it's one of the most unique styles that you're ever going to find in all of college basketball, where they essentially just dared teams to shoot from three-point range. Their three-point rate was not just number one in all of college basketball, it was by far number one in all of college basketball in terms of their three-point rate, as opponents against South Alabama, they took a whopping 59.3% of their shots from three-point range. No other team was above 52.1%. They pretty much said, you want to take threes? Bring it on. You launch them. And then Louisiana Monroe, it wasn't quite to this extreme, but they were in the top 30 with this regard as well. They allowed opponents to take 45.1% of their shots from three-point range. Those were your two massive outliers in the conference. Nobody else was quite to this extreme, but there's really not a lot of three-point shooting in the conference, and there are more and more teams that are essentially daring their opponents to be able to shoot it from three-point range, and that's very much noted with regards to the betting trends and what you saw with regards to totals, because in the Sun Belt, as I was mentioning, a lot of slower teams, a lot of teams that are a little bit suspect with their three-point shooting, and that did allow for a lot of these teams to be, shall we say, a little bit more underwhelming, as you only had two teams in the conference play more than 52% of their games to the over last year. Texas State, they had some really good three-point shooting, unexpected three-point shooting. They were actually a top 50 team with regards to their 3-point shooting, so they were an outlier with that regard. 18 overs, 11 unders, and a push. Georgia State, 17 overs, 15 unders. And then Louisiana Monroe, they went 16 overs and 15 unders, so relatively break even on the minus 110 spread. A little bit less than profitable, but still not too bad. And then Coastal Carolina, 15 overs, 15 unders. And then you had 5 different teams play at least 60% of their games to the under. Southern Miss, 12 overs, 18 unders, and a push. South Alabama, 11 overs, 17 unders, and 2 pushes. Old Dominion, 12 overs, 19 unders, 2 pushes. Louisiana, 12 overs, 20 unders. Appalachian State, 9 overs, 19 unders, and a push. Troy was 15 overs to 18 unders. James Madison, 14 overs to 16 unders. Marshall, 15 overs to 16 unders. And James Madison, by the way, well outside the top 250 in terms of total possessions per game as well. And this really manifested itself when you got into non-conference play, because in conference play, you actually had a few over teams. Coastal Carolina, 12 overs to 7 unders because they just generated no turnovers whatsoever. Texas State, 11 overs, 7 unders, and a push in conference play. In conference play, you had Louisiana Monroe, James Madison, Marshall, all have 11 overs apiece, with Monroe and Madison 8 unders, 9 unders. For Marshall, Georgia State, 12 overs to 8 unders. So you did have quite a few overwhelming teams, while Appalachian State, 4 overs, 14 unders, and a push in conference play. And then you had a quartet of teams between 60 and 66.7% to the under in conference play. Southern Miss, 8 overs to 12 unders. Louisiana, 7 overs, 13 unders. Old Dominion, 7 overs, 14 unders, and a push. And then South Alabama, 6 overs, 12 unders, and a push as well. But in non-conference play, these teams were really good at being able to slow it down. Only 2 teams that played more overs than unders in non-conference play. Texas State, 7 overs to 4 unders, and Arkansas State, 8 overs to 6 unders. As you had 8 different teams play at least 54% of their games to the under in non-conference play. Georgia Southern, Louisiana Monroe, Georgia State, Louisiana, Southern Miss, Marshall, Coastal Carolina, and James Madison, with Coastal Carolina and James Madison both going 8 unders to 3 overs in non-conference play. And then when it comes to an against the spread sort of look with this Sun Belt Conference, it is now a very spread out Sun Belt, where you've got a lot of teams down south, but now you've got Virginia added in there as well, and it led to a lot of these teams being a little bit shaky with regards to their against the spread record. You can tell that the Sun Belt has lost a little bit of steam. Troy was your best against the spread team by far, 21-12 against the spread. Georgia State, 19-13 against the spread. Arkansas State, they went 20-14-1 against the spread. And then Marshall, nice year for them, 17-12-2 against the spread, while South Alabama, they were 17-13 against the spread. Old Dominion was a whole hum, 16-16-1 against the spread. But then James Madison, they just had really big struggles early on. You can tell that they just weren't able to keep up that steam for making the NCAA tournament and winning 30 games 2 seasons ago, even though Preston Spradlin is a good coach. 11-19 against the spread. Louisiana was 12-20 against the spread. Appalachian State, 11-18 against the spread. Louisiana Monroe, 12-19 against the spread. Georgia Southern, 14-18-1 against the spread. And you notice a commonality. All the bad teams in the conference, they just were not making you money as well. They weren't necessarily doing the world's greatest job of being able to covering as underdogs. As you take a look at the against the spread record that these teams had as underdogs, you had 3 very demonstrative good teams. Georgia State, they went 11-9 against the spread as an underdog. South Alabama, 6-2 against the spread as an underdog. Arkansas State, 5-1-1 against the spread as an underdog. And then you had 4 500 teams. Troy, Old Dominion, Georgia Southern, and Marshall all covered 50% of their games as an underdog. James Madison was terrible as an underdog. 1-7 against the spread as a dog. Louisiana Monroe, 10-17 against the spread as an underdog. Louisiana, another one of your bad teams, 9-14 against the spread as an underdog. Southern Miss, another bad team, 9-13 against the spread as an underdog. Appalachian State was 4-6 in this role as well. And a big reason why is because the travel, I feel like, has gotten to quite a few of these teams as well. You did have 4 teams that were really good against the spread on the road. Arkansas State was 10-3-1 against the spread on the road. Troy was 10-5 against the spread on the road. South Alabama, 9-5 against the spread on the road. Louisiana, 7-4 against the spread on the road. But then you had Appalachian State go 5-8 against the spread on the road. Louisiana Monroe, 5-9 against the spread on the road. James Madison, 2-11 against the spread on the road. They're one of the more spread out teams here in the Sun Belt. And then a lot of 500 teams. Coastal Carolina, Georgia State, Old Dominion, Georgia Southern all covered 50% of their games on the road. And then Southern Miss, they went 6-8 against the spread on the road. And there were quite a few teams that had just struggles against the spread when they were outside the conference as well. Coastal Carolina was actually great against the spread in non-conference play. They were catching a bunch of points, so they were able to go 7-3-1 against the spread in non-conference play, so they were able to do a relatively rock-solid job there. Texas State was your next best team at 6-4-1 against the spread in non-conference play. Troy was 7-5 against the spread in non-con play, and then South Alabama 6-5 against the spread in non-con, but you had Louisiana go 3-9 against the spread in non-conference play. Again, all the bottom teams. Louisiana Monroe 4-8 against the spread in non-conference play. Southern Miss, Old Dominion both went 4-7 against the spread in non-conference play. Marshall 4-6-1 against the spread in non-conference play, and then a lot of 500 teams. Georgia State, Appalachian State, Georgia Southern, 6-6 against the spread in non-conference play, and then James Madison, 5-6-1 against the spread in non-conference play. So it's a very unique conference. It's a conference that has seen a lot of changes through the years, and a man that has done a great job of being able to keep up with them all is our good friend in Mr. Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16. He's joined me for this conference preview a few times, and he joins me next to break down all 14 teams in the Sun Belt right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast, the Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. This is a Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition, and I know that Blake has joined me for a few of these Sun Belt Conference previews throughout the years, as he does a great job over at Southeastern 16, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. He is out there in Sun Belt country, as he's out there in the southeast part of the country, which Sun Belt is out covering like half the country, so it makes it a little bit easier there. But that said, with Blake, he's just such a wealth of knowledge. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter /X at the Blake Lovell. Last name is spelled Lovell. And Blake, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yep, thanks as always for having me, Greg.
Thank you for joining me, Blake. And how about if we take a look at what is going to be such a fascinating conference? And how about if we start with the team that has a coach that I feel like we both have a lot of reverence for, Dustin Kern and Appalachian State. It's going to be a little bit of a new look team for Appalachian State, but we know that this is going to be one of the slowest teams in all of college basketball. They've got that set identity there. They don't quite have the versatility that they did from a season ago, but they bring back Alonzo Dodd from last year. Kassan Jennings, I thought, was a really good gift for them. And for Appalachian State, even though it's going to be very much a new look team, most of the teams out there in the Sun Belt are new look, and I think a lot of this conference is going to be banking on good coaching, and Dustin Kern is a guy that I think could get this team right back towards the top of the conference.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, a guy that certainly has an identifiable style that they like to play on both sides of the court, and certainly, coming off of the year before where they were just so successful and winning 27 games, going 16-2, that's something that you can certainly try to get back to. And it's not like they haven't been there before and had that opportunity. And so I think he's certainly, done a good job settling in there. They've had some success in this conference. And so that to me makes it easier when you're trying to figure out which teams you feel like you can sort of bank on, because you kind of know what it takes in terms of building your roster. And like you said, I mean, certainly they're going to have to replace some pretty key pieces from last year, as we know. And so to be able to do that, you kind of know the kind of players you need to go get. And I feel like he's done a good job of that, throughout this entire era that he's been there. And so I do look at them and feel like, all right, they're in a pretty good position. They've been a good defensive team pretty much the entire time he's been there. Certainly there have been, some years where they've dipped a little bit, but they've been pretty strong on the defensive side. And like we said, I think one of the reasons for that is they just kind of have a style that they know how to play and know how to recruit to. I feel pretty good about them once again in the Dustin Kern's era to hit at least that double-digit win mark in the Sun Belt.
Yep, I feel really good about them as well. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily feel great about this team, as they moved on from Keith Richard, longtime coach, last pretty much regular season, and now it's Phil Cunningham that comes in, and they bring in Martavius Russell from Mississippi State. That's the good news. They hit the non-Division I ranks for a few guys. They actually brought in a few relatively solid freshmen. Wiggy Ball is a guy that has a little bit of upside, but I look at this team and they've got one guy with Division I experience that's taller than 6'5", and I recognize that that this conference does not have a bunch of guys that are 7 feet tall, but this feels like it's a rebuild here for Louisiana Monroe, and any sort of win should be treated like gold, because I am not seeing too many on the schedule.
Yeah, I mean, Phil Cunningham jumping back into the Sun Belt, a long time coach, as we know, back when he was coaching Troy there for a bit. And yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting one. I mean, again, it's someone that does have familiarity with the Sun Belt, but that was the Sun Belt that also looked a little bit different during his tenure from I think 2013 to 19 or something like that.
Like 3/4 of the conference has been turned over.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's the same conference in name, but it's not the same conference, and probably that he was used to facing when he was at Troy throughout those years. And that's why I feel like it does. It makes it harder to really have a great feel. Like you said, I mean, this is the team that finished at the bottom of the league last year, and I just tend to think that it's one of those where you try to go out and get the pieces that you can start that rebuild, but is it going to be a quick process? I would say probably not. Again, because you always know when you have a coaching change, you're going to bring in a lot of new faces. And I just feel like this is one of those teams that even with battling an experience thing too, there are just a lot of other teams in the conference I think have a little bit more experience than they do. Again, I think Phil Cunningham, nice guy, nice to see him back in the head coaching ranks, but I think he'll have his work cut out for him there, at least in season 1.
Yeah, this is looking rough. They're going to need Martavius Russell to be Michael Jordan 2.0 for them to be able to make a run here. This is a team that I take a look at, and I don't think that they're going to be great. I don't think that they're going to be bad. They have a lot to replace from last year, and that'd be Marshall. And for Marshall, they were really good down low under Cornelius Jackson. They were able to win 20 games last season. They had to move on from the D'Antoni era, and they were able to do so very nicely. But Dezane Mingo really stepped up in the second half of the season along Jalen Spear. Both of those guys are now out of the fold. Wilson Dubinsky, he's going to be able to hold things down in the backcourt. And when you bring in someone who's 7'4", Matthew Von Coleman, you want to continue things down low. That's the way that you do it. But that said, there's going to be a lot of moving pieces. They do lose a bit from last season, and I feel like this could be one of those classic teams that starts off slow and picks up steam towards the back half of the season.
Yeah, I mean, again, another one of those teams just went out and had to fill a lot of spots, and I think it's simply a matter of how does it all sort of come together. And at least I think they've got some older guys on this roster. They're going to be sporting out several grad, transfers, and certainly size, I think, is not an issue when you look at the front court that they're going to be able to put out there. And I think that is something that's going to give an opportunity to have a lot of success. It's just being able to bring in some pretty big guys and seeing how they can play with that. But like you said, to get to 20 wins, I think in Cornelius Jackson's first season, that was certainly because, like we had mentioned, certainly there had been some up and downs during the D'Antoni era, and we knew they kind of had that identifiable style we always talk about, very high up tempo. Last year's team played fast, but certainly not to the level that we had seen, most years under Marshall. So they're one of the more intriguing teams, I think, when you just look at it from a roster standpoint. Like I mentioned, I think it's just of having the big sort of team that you have in the front court. You've got some guards that have some decent size as well. I just think, again, overall, it's the same question for me that I have with a lot of these teams in this range. It's how do some of the guys you're going to bring in that are playmakers, how do they play off of each other, and really just how does the full package come together there for the Thundering Herd?
Yep, absolutely. As Blake Lovell, who does such great work over at Southeastern 16, he's joining me right here for the Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I think that this is a very intriguing team as Georgia Southern does lose quite a few pieces from a season ago, but getting back Nicavian White along Tyron Moore is going to be big because for Georgia Southern last year it was a bit of a slog, but much of that was due to the fact that they were so banged up a year ago. So being able to bring back two guys like that, I think is relatively solid. It is going to be a team that's going to be made up a lot of transfers outside of White and Moore, and Alden Applewhite is someone that comes over from Murray State. I believe that he spent some time with Portland as well. He should be able to get the job done. I do think that this team has a really good starting five, and if they could get anything out of Avante Parker, who's been so inconsistent over the last few years, that'll be great. But it also does feel like a little bit of a top-heavy team as well that needs a bit more in the backcourt.
Yeah, I'm curious, like you said, another team that's bringing in a lot of new guys. And, Charlie Henry, who we've talked about before over the years, former Alabama assistant there. And so you kind of remember sort of a guy that was able to really help bring in some pretty talented players on that Alabama team, did a good job of, like we mentioned, being able to recruit to a certain style. And you kind of saw that this past season where, we saw since he took over a couple of years ago, they're going to play fast. They're going to be a team that, again, kind of has those different traits that you're sort of used to seeing. They're going to shoot a lot of threes. They're going to get a lot of points from there. I think almost 39% of their points from three last year. That was around the top 30 nationally in terms of their point distribution. So it's going to be a team, I think, just based on what we've seen the first couple of years, they're going to shoot the three. We know that. And it's really just a matter of, can they be a team that can figure out some of these other areas that they've not been able to necessarily thrive in, did a better job of sort of forcing turnovers last year. And like I said, there are some of those themes where you go back and kind of see how he was able to use that under Nate Oates at Alabama, and now what they're trying to do just from a roster construction standpoint at Georgia Southern. So, yeah, another one that I think is kind of intriguing. They've been kind of in that same spot the first couple of years, 8 wins in the conference. Can they take that next step forward? Wouldn't be surprised if they're able to, again, maybe grab a couple more wins in there. But we always say this too, Greg. It's like, how do you get out of that middle in a conference like this where there's just a lot of teams you feel like are jumbled together? Not exactly sure, if that next step is taken this year, but I think there is still some pretty interesting potential and upside with this team.
And if you want to talk about a jumbled middle in the conference, there were 4 teams that went 13-5 to tie for the conference regular season crown. There were 4 teams that went 8-10, one 9-9, one 10-8, one 12-6. So yeah, there was that. And how about another team from the state of Georgia that went 8-10 in the conference? That'd be Georgia State. And for Jonas Hayes, I just expected a little bit more from him in his first few seasons over at Georgia State. We remember the run that he went on over at Xavier when he had to step in at the end of the year. They make that nice run in the NIT, and it's been 3 straight losing seasons for Georgia State. Good news is they do bring back a few guys, bringing back a guy in Jelani Hamilton who put in double figures. That's a nice place to start. You bring back Malachi Brown, who led the team in assists, and that's more than what you could say for most of the teams in this conference. But at the same time, too, some of the guys that they're bringing in, not necessarily wowing me. Ja'Kai Newton is someone that comes on over from the Big Ten, but really didn't play at all. You've got Hamilton and Brown who are knowns, and the rest of the roster feels like a complete unknown.
Yeah, like you said, I think you're certainly looking at those 2 guys and feeling like, they played 27 plus minutes last year each. Brown played 30, I think. And so you're kind of banking on them being the stalwarts here to be able to really push this roster forward. And like you said, yeah, I think it was when they hired him, you're thinking, all right, this guy's just sort of coming off this huge run there. Can they kind of parlay that into some success in terms of building the roster you need to be successful? Really struggled that first year. These past couple years that they've at least, I think, gotten things in the right direction. But like we just talked about with Georgia State, it's like, can you get it to where you're just not stuck in that middle? And I think, again, if you're just looking at it on paper, which is all we can do to start looking at these teams for the season, I don't know that it's necessarily jumping out to me to say that I think they're going to jump into that, group of 4 at the top that went 13-5 or something like that. It may be hard to sort of project that, but with 2 key returners, like you mentioned, I think that is something that there are other teams that simply don't have that. And so that can at least be something they can build off of, have a little bit of that experience from last season. Just can they find a way to, again, turn that into some wins? I think that will be the biggest thing with them. We'll see, because it is. This is kind of one of those turning point years, right? Year 4 now under this regime. They've been able to stay pretty stable the past couple years, but you don't want to have that big drop down. But you also maybe want to see, can we flip that from 8-10 to maybe 10-8 this year?
And I think that this team is very intriguing as well. As for Southern Miss, things did not go well for Jay Lander over the last few years. They brought in Andre Curbelo. I thought that was going to be a disaster, and I think that it's even worse than a lot of people expected. So now they get to turn the page there, and now they bring in a guy in Landon Glasper, who was dismissed at the end of the year from North Carolina A&T, but was supplying North Carolina A&T with darn near 20 points per game. So we'll see how this one works out. They bring in Cam Polisi, who is actually solid if you look at the individual numbers at Canisius. Problem was, Canisius was one of the worst teams in all of college basketball last year. They bring in someone like Deja Benoit, hopefully you said that correct, from Elkhorn State. They've got guys that put up numbers last year. They weren't a part of winning teams whatsoever, though, and I'm very intrigued with Blake Lander, probably being one of the better players for this team, coming on over from LIU.
There are so many new guys here. And it's like, again, it's just, you look at it and you're like, their entire rotation, minus probably 1, I guess, is new. And I feel like that is just something where that is kind of, to an extreme here when you look at what they're going to try to do. But also, it is something where you're like, well, it didn't exactly work out last year. So we know we kind of need to make that move to be able to try to make this roster better. And I feel like, when you look at kind of some of the disappointment, especially coming off, the year they had several years ago, where they won 25 games, 14 games in the conference. It feels like a big step back, to have the year they had last year. And so I'm curious to see if they can turn it around. I think one of the things too, they played at such a high tempo last year, but they just simply weren't good enough offensively to kind of turn that into anything. They're pretty interesting here because, like you said, it's a who's who of new faces on this team. But I think there's some talent, though, that they've definitely brought in. It's just, can it all kind of come together? Another team, I think, that's got some pretty good size on this roster in the front court. And you do have some experience there, but this is probably one of the more curious teams, I feel like, to see if they can kind of turn this back to where they had it a couple of years ago.
They seem to actually have a pretty high ceiling, but man, that actually seems like a really low floor as well. And I look at this team as being one of intrigue as well. Louisiana, they bring in a guy in Joshua Lewis who's a top 150 recruit. You don't find that very often in the Sun Belt. They bring in a guy in Jamarian Keller who he's got some nice power conference experience along Dorian Finster. Finster, I believe, played a little bit over at Kansas State, played some at Sam Houston State with Keller last season. He was actually pretty rock solid over at Oklahoma State. He was putting in their 5.5 points per contest, and he was a starter, and you don't find that very often. Louisiana, as we know, they went through a mid-season coaching change last year as well, so it's a little bit of a changing of the guard after it had been Bob Marlin for so long as well. Lots of new out there with Louisiana, to say the least.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, it's just so odd to not start a season and be like, all right, well, here's what Bob Marlin's team's going to do because he's just been there forever. But yeah, I mean, Quantas White now, with the opportunity to start the season here and feel like, okay, can we do some things to try to get this program that, again, we sort of mentioned throughout the years. I mean, it was a very, very competitive program in this conference, and we talk about stability and consistency. It's been one of the more consistent ones, I would say, because we were talking about Phil Cunningham earlier at Troy. I mean, they've seen everything in the Sun Belt. I mean, it's just like, for Bob Marlin, how many different iterations of this conference did he see since he was there for 15 years or something? But now, it's, can you kind of keep this team right there? Because I think the number on this was that they've won at least 8 conference games every single year during his tenure. And so that's kind of a pretty wild stat when you think about it, especially in an era like this where you have so many kind of moving parts with your roster. And so I think this is another team that, like you said, I think with some of the guys you have returning, you feel like maybe able to play a bit of a bigger role this season as well. Pretty intrigued by this team because I think that stat in and of itself to me is pretty interesting. It's just seemingly they've always found a way. And can this program kind of keep things going under new leadership here? We said something we've not had to talk about in over a decade and a half here.
No, we have not. As Blake Lovell, he does such great work over at Southeastern 16. He's joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And a team that underwent a big change last year was Coastal Carolina because it felt like Cliff Ellis had been there for 100 billion years. They transferred things on over to Justin Gray. And for Justin Gray, going from Western Carolina on over to Coastal Carolina, not necessarily a savory season number one, but they have something that a lot of teams don't have in this conference. 2 of their top 4 scorers returning. Josh Mio out there in the backcourt was averaging about 8.5 points, a little bit over 2 assists per game. And the fact that 2.2 assists per game led the team is not great. Rasheed Jones is back. Number 2 scorer, 2.1 assists per game. The fact that he very nearly was the leader in assists, again, not great. But they bring in AJ Dantzler, who was pretty rock solid out there in the NEC, a guy that's able to bomb it from 3-point range. They're also bringing in a little bit of size with Braden McVicker. Hopefully I said that correctly. Andre Mobilia, he stays in the fold. Jerry Ngokpat, he transfers on over from within the Sun Belt. And I feel like Coastal Carolina has a chance to maybe not bust through and be like a top 5 team, but I think that they could go from the cellar and perhaps be more towards the middle of this conference.
Yeah, I do think and maybe it's just by default where they finish, but you do feel like they're a team that has a chance for maybe the most forward movement, being 3-15 last year and feeling like you said, I mean, Justin Gray, there's a reason he got that job. Felt like someone who certainly this past couple of years at Western Carolina really started to turn the program around. And so you have to replace a legend like Cliff Ellis. You want to bring someone who feels like they're sort of on the way up. And he is, I think, someone still looked at like that. It was just a tough first season. And I'm just, again, kind of curious to see if they can improve in some of these areas. And I think that's where simply just having a better roster is going to play a big role. I mean, they were a team like many, I think, that maybe have a year like that. They weren't all games where they just simply weren't in them. They lost quite a few close games last year. And sometimes it can be just, can you fill that 1 or 2 spots that help you get that player that's going to help you get that extra 4 or 5 points in a game. It helps you win games like that. And by having some of these returners that play in 30-plus minutes, I think that's something that really should help them take a step forward. And I'd kind of be pretty, surprised if they didn't take a bit of a step forward here. Like you said, I don't know if it'll be all the way to the top or anything, but I would think that they have a pretty good opportunity to maybe at least double their win total from last year.
Yep, I think so as well. And I think that this is just such a hilarious situation. You go from one Alabama assistant taking over the program to another Alabama assistant taking over the program as they lose Brian Hodgson. Arkansas State does in the offseason, and they bring in Ryan Pannone. And Ryan Pannone is returning 0 points from last year, and yet if you look on Bert Torvik, they are projected to win the conference. So that makes things very interesting to say the least. And there is talent here. Matt Heyman was a double-figure score from Stephen F. Austin. TJ Caldwell, that was a guy that was seeing very meaningful minutes over there at Ole Miss. Chandler Jackson, that's a guy that was able to bomb it from three over at Florida State. So there's clearly talent here. These guys have not played with each other whatsoever, and Ryan Pannone is coach as a head coach at the Division I level as many minutes as the two of us. Very interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's if you're an assistant under Nate Oates, you got a pretty good chance to coach in the Sun Belt at some point. Yeah, I mean, that is just one of those things you don't see very often. Again, taking over Brian Hodgson and feeling like, okay, can this really be something where, hey, I mean, he's probably doing everything he can to try to help him keep this continuity going. And you mentioned it. I mean, I think there's obvious reasons as to why they probably could be the projected team to win the league, just because I think that he's done a really good job with the roster. And I think we probably have a pretty good idea of the style and how they're going to play. Like I said, I'd be stunned if you don't see some of those things that are familiar, kind of like we talked about with Charlie Henry at Georgia Southern. Now, again, everyone's going to be different in terms of their coaching approach and all that, but having a completely new roster, having so many new guys, this is your kind of first big opportunity, I guess you could say, to say, all right, can we now turn this into a situation where we feel like, can we just get the continuity we need out of this roster and be able to keep this thing going? Yeah, I think easily the most fascinating team, not because they may win the conference, but it's just all the elements you mentioned and just trying to see if we're going to see those same themes. And if you do, go from someone like Brian Hodgson being able to get them in a position, where they were just having a lot of success, and then the next Alabama guy comes in and does the same. They may just keep this process going until the end of time, Greg. Arkansas State may just say, you know what? Every single time we lose our coach, we're just going to go to Nate Oates and say, hey, do you have another guy to send our way? Not been a bad idea so far.
There used to be an Australian pipeline for St. Mary's. Now there's an Arkansas State pipeline for coaches just asking Nate Oates for one of their assistants. So good, clean family fun there. As we do have Blake Lovell, who does great work over at Southeastern 16, joining me for the Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And you want to talk about a man that has seen everything in the Sun Belt? Well, when he started out in the Sun Belt, he was with a team that's no longer in the Sun Belt at UT Arlington. That'd be Scott Cross over at Troy. And Troy had a nice breakout season last year with 23 wins, albeit they didn't necessarily shoot it well from three-point range, but the defense was absolutely tenacious. They do have to replace a lot of the top-end guys, Tate Conway, Miles Rigsby. They're out of the fold, but Thomas Dowd was very rock-solid down low. He had himself a nice second half of the season. They bring in a guy in Corbin Green, who actually spent a little bit of time over at Texas Tech. Didn't really play a lot over at Texas Tech, but I remember when he was at Air Force, he was relatively rock-solid. Victor Valdez is a guy that at 6'7" has a little bit of upside. Very interesting team to say the least, especially with Cooper Campbell being able to have a nice freshman year, and he's another guy that returns.
Yeah, I mean, continuity is the theme here, and I think that to me gives Troy a really kind of leg up on some of these other teams, because you said it. I mean, it was just a matter of time, I think, to really see Scott Cross put it all together. Those first couple of years were rough at Troy, but I mean, remember, this is a guy, when he got fired, I guess it was, at UT Arlington, like, people were just stunned. Like, they're like, are you kidding me? Like, this guy was one of the better coaches out there at that level. It was just stunning to see how it all played out. You knew he'd find his way back into the head coaching ranks again. He's just too good of a coach, I think, for that not to happen. It was nice, again, to see them get to the NCAA tournament last year. And I think he's got a team that simply could get back there, like you mentioned. Having the returning pieces on this roster, Dowd was someone that I think is only going to, have his numbers go up, basically 10-7 last year. I think you're certainly looking at a guy who feels like he could get close to that double-double type mark this year on this particular team. Yeah, it's really just a matter of, can you replace some of those things, or really so many of those things that someone like Connor Way did. That was a big piece of the puzzle last year. But I have a lot of confidence in Scott Cross and being able to go out and fill some of those spots. But I think it is the returning guys on this team too, and his ability to develop those guys into bigger players on this particular team, I feel like this is a team that I'm pretty confident in to have some success this season.
And this is one of my favorite teams to take a look at in college basketball, and it's all because of the coach. Their coach is Mike Jones. You might ask who, and I'm going to say Mike Jones. Over at Old Dominion, they looked absolutely terrible to begin the year last year. Went on a nice run in like January, early February, hit a little bit of a thud towards back half of the season, but we've talked about how many transfers there are within the conference. There's going to be continuity with this team. They don't have a ton in the backcourt, but Caleb Swinton-Rogers, a guy that began his career at Maryland, right around 6'11", 7 feet tall, he's able to block some shots. Stephon Walker was out of the lineup a little bit. He's back after he was averaging right around about 7 rebounds per game. They're going to be looking to Casey Shaw, who was over at Maryland Eastern Shore. He put up good numbers despite the fact that there was nothing around him over at Maryland Eastern Shore. They also bring in a guy in LJ Thomas. He's got a little bit of upside coming in from the Atlantic Sun over at Austin Peay and NC State as well. And I look at this Old Dominion team, and it felt like they found something towards back half of the season last year. And in a Sunbelt where you don't have great size, I think that these guys could be monsters on the glass.
Too. I mean, it's like we talk about what can be the separator for certain teams, and I think just having a high profile score like Robert Davis returning, like I feel like that is just something where, again, we've talked about these other teams just don't have a lot of that. And then you've got all these breakout candidates. You mentioned some of the guys that played 20-ish type minutes last year, and now seeing what their numbers are going to do, and specifically that duo in the front court. You mentioned Walker and Swinton-Rogers. I mean, those guys combining for what averaged about 12, I guess, rebounds per game combined between those two. Both played upwards of 21 minutes, I think. And obviously, Swinton-Rogers basically blocking 2 shots a game. There's a lot of intrigue with this team, and I think it is kind of a fun one to look at because it does feel like they are in a position to take a big step forward. Lost quite a few close games last year, it felt like, in conference play, and certainly made that big run there in the tournament to get to Troy there at the end. But I think this is a team that I would fully expect, if we're looking at kind of most improved possibilities for teams, I think this is one that's certainly 8-10 last year. Not terrible, all things considered. We said there's kind of just a group of teams in that spot, but I would think this is a winning team this year in this conference. And I think one of the keys, like I said, is just having a big time scorer returning with what feels like a front court that's only going to break out even more.
Absolutely. And then I think that this team is so intriguing as well because we always look at good coaches. We always look at guys in season number 2 trying to be able to break out. And James Madison, they made a really good hire, in my opinion, Preston Spradlin. First few games were a little bit rough for them in the non-conference portion, but they finished tied for first in the regular season. They do have to replace quite a few guys from a season ago, but that said, I think that they've done a good job of replacing those guys. Eddie Ricks is someone that came over with Preston Spradlin on over from Morehead State, so that's going to be able to help them out quite a bit. Paul Lewis is someone that played at Vanderbilt, UTSA last year, but couldn't get on the floor last year over at UTSA, so he's a little bit of an upside guy. Justin McBride is someone I like. A Cornish at 6'6". He did some solid work over at Nichols and Ohio, began his career over at Maryland. I feel like there's a lot of upside with this team. There's a few unknowns. How is Cliff Davis going to be playing in the backcourt, and can Paul Lewis be able to recover from injury? But that said, I take a look at James Madison, and I think that this team has a lot of upside and one of the best coaches in the conference.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot to replace, but like you said, I think you just got a winner as your head coach, a guy that just seemingly always finds a way. I mean, it was going to, we didn't expect him to get to 30 wins or anything like we saw with Mark Byington before he left for Vanderbilt, but I think it was kind of just a matter of, hey, how far can you kind of take them in year one? And I mean, to be 20-12, 13-5 in the league, they were so good down the stretch, as we saw after kind of just sort of a pedestrian start. Then they just closed in a really impressive fashion. And so I think it is kind of putting your trust in the head coach here and the guys that he's brought in. I mentioned Rick's returns. I mean, that's kind of your top returner, but still played quite a few minutes last year. And I would think he is someone too that probably is another candidate, for breaking into that double-digit tier scoring-wise. Should be one of the, more high-profile rebounders just in terms of the numbers. So, yeah, I don't really have a lot of questions with James Madison outside of simply the question we ask for every other team that we seemingly go through, where it's just like, how do all the new transfers come in and make a difference here? And based on the talent that they've assembled, I would think that they feel pretty good about that working out.
And I would like to give a congratulations to South Alabama for cornering the market on non-Division I guys that come into their program because they've done it again. They're bringing in Chauncey Harris, who is an absolute animal at the non-Division I level. Now he's going to be coming in after he was playing up there in the NAIA ranks and was putting up there like 20 points per contest. And this was one of the most unique styles that you're ever going to find. South Alabama pretty much dared you to shoot from three. Opponents took over 55% of their shots from three-point range against South Alabama. I've never seen anything like it. It led to quite a few wins for them, a little bit of volatility, but how do we take a look at a South Alabama team that, well, everyone is zigging and everyone is like, you know what, teams are going to shoot the three. They're actually encouraging their opponents to shoot threes.
Hey, Richie Riley has figured it out. He said, you know what? I am going to find that style, and we are going to be so different that we're just going to let it be. And, hey, it's nothing to complain about, I guess, to this point, because really, if you kind of look at it, they've not really had a bad season under him. And, last year was kind of the point where getting to that 13-win mark, having a chance, being right there with an opportunity to get closer to the tournament. But, yeah, I mean, I think it is something where having something like that where you're just saying, you know what, take your shot. And we feel like we've got a team we can put together to try to defend it. I'm kind of fascinated to see do they do it again. And if they do, well, I mean, they've got kind of a pretty fascinating roster. I feel like to see if, several returning guys that you feel like, as I mentioned, guys who feel like they can be in a position where they can take a step forward. They've obviously got to replace some top tier talent, but at the same time, like usually, and we talk about this, I feel like in all these sort of mid-major type conferences, we say it's just, at some point, I do think it just comes down to the coaches and feeling like, all right, are you going to kind of put your stock in someone like Richie Riley, or are you going to take the risk of one of these guys that maybe's not been as consistent with one of these teams that's a little bit lower and trying to find ways for them to jump a Richie Riley coach South Alabama team? That's a hard thing to do. And so I feel like with the returners, with the guys he's brought in, and again, just seemingly being able to put together a roster that's been pretty good and pretty elite in some top areas statistically, maybe that is going to be the difference for them being able to, again, force some turnovers. They've been good at that, as we know. I think South Alabama probably figures it out.
Yep, and they bring back John Broome. No relation to Janai Broome, but John Broome along J.J. Weeden. Just still so hilarious. Opponents last year against South Alabama attempted 23 two-pointers per game and 33.8 three-point shots per game. Never seen anything like it before in my life, and we've got one last team to talk about. That would be Texas State. Texas State is always a team that is built around slow, controlled play, and Terrence Johnson has done a very solid job over at Texas State in his first few seasons, and they've got returning talent. Caden Gums is back after he was able to give the team 11 points per contest. It was a very, very small sample size from Mark Drone last year of 10 games, but Mark Drone was able to give the team double figures as well. He's going to be back in the fold for this team. They've got Jalen Bolden coming in from within the conference. Makai Willis comes in from within the conference. As a matter of fact, I think both of those guys were at Louisiana Monroe at one point or another. And I look at this Texas State team, and I think that once again, they're probably not going to win the conference, but they're going to be one of those pesky teams that tries to vie for like a top 5 spot.
You go 9-9, 16-16 last year. And as we just said, it still feels like it's going to be a season where I don't know if there's necessarily just a team that completely runs away with it at the top. You could still have a bit of a jumbled mess up there. And that's where, like, if you're Texas State, okay, just win a couple more games. And that puts you one step closer to being in that jumbled mess, maybe at the top. And so I think that's the thing is sort of you literally are the team that feels like you're sort of right there in the middle based on kind of the way you finished last year. Now I think it's, you mentioned sort of being able to bring some guys in within the conference, but really more specifically being able to bring back the returners that you feel like are really going to give you that big boost you need to be able to be a team that can bank on some of that experience, especially with those guys in Drone and Gums, as you talked about. These are just, guys that played a lot of minutes, very productive players, and feeling like, all right, this is a team that probably has a chance to really take a step forward. But as always, it's just if you're going to take a step forward, you got to jump some of these other teams. And we talked about the teams you got to jump are coached by, Dustin Kearns and Richie Riley and Scott Cross. And, we talked about the Alabama pipeline and all the rosters those guys have been able to put together. But I think at least if you're looking at it and feeling like, all right, this is a team that seems like, the foundation looks pretty good. And let's not forget, too, Terrence Johnson had a lot of success, those first couple seasons. And I think that they are on track to getting right back where they need to be.
Yep, I am right there with you. And Blake, you always get us on track with your great insights into this wonderful game of college basketball. You're doing an amazing job taking a look at things over at Southeastern 16 and so much more. So we'll let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, always appreciate it, Greg. Yeah, you can check out all of our SEC-related stuff, Southeastern 16 on YouTube. And then, everything else I do college basketball related. You can follow me on Twitter/X at the Blake Lovell.
And Blake does an absolutely incredible job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. And every single time he joins me, he lends such great insight. So big thanks to Blake for joining me on Coast to Coast Superstar, part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And this is the Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition. So coming up next, I do give you guys my projector finish for the Sun Belt. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Great to get Blake Lovell back on the Sun Belt Conference preview of this fine podcast. He's joined me a few times for the Sun Belt Conference preview. He's doing absolutely amazing work over there at Southeastern 16. Every single time he joins me, he lends such amazing insights. It's a very complex conference with a lot of unique moving pieces, and he did a great job of being able to break it all down. So a big thanks to Blake for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast. I give you my projector or finish for the Sun Belt as per usual with a conference preview. Any news and notes that I might have missed in college basketball on Saturday, I will recap those on the podcast tomorrow because I do want these previews to be one of two things. One, evergreen, because if you're listening to this on August 31st, September 31st, what have you, I want to make sure that it's still good information for you. And for two, I do want to give these conference previews as much sparkle and shine as humanly possible. So how about if we dive in on my projector or finish? And at dead last, I'm going with Louisiana Monroe. Man, this is a rough roster to say the least. They do bring in a few guys from the non-Division I ranks that should be able to give you a little bit of upside. Martavius Russell is the main guy. I believe that he was like a top 250 recruit when he went to Mississippi State, but never really got out there at Mississippi State. They're going to be looking to a guy in Kristen Lewis who, he was able to dole out right around about 4.5 assists, 15.5 points per game when he was over at Pearl River Community College, but man, this is a completely new look team for this bunch. And I thought that Lewis had originally went to the Raging Cajuns. He decided that he was going to be going to UL Monroe instead, but this is a bunch that they've got a very, very rough uphill climb to have. You've got Mr. Cunningham back after he spent some time over at Troy for many, many years. Phil Cunningham, he's a relatively solid coach, but he's just got nothing to work with whatsoever. There is no low post play whatsoever outside of Brentley Noel. He's like the only guy on the roster that's currently above 6'5" that has Division I experience. And he was over at Southern last year, giving you some okay production, but you have to go from being an okay big man in the SWAC to being in the Sun Belt. That's just not going to go well. Dead last of my projector finish. I'm going with Louisiana Monroe. At number 13, it's Southern Miss. It just feels like Jay Lander did not learn his mistake from the Andre Carbello blow-up, as he's brought in a few guys that, they had good production at their previous stop. Landon Glasper was a nice scorer over at North Carolina A&T, but he was dismissed from North Carolina A&T with something like 8 or 10 games remaining last year, 18.5 points, 2.5 assists per game, but what did that lead to? A whole bunch of losing. And now you're bringing in Cam Polisi, who he was a rock solid scorer when he was over at Canisius last season, but for Polisi, about 6.5 points, 5 rebounds per game, shot 40% from 3 at 6'5". Canisius was one of the worst teams in all of college basketball last year. So I just don't know how these pieces are going to be adding up. Denai Benoit is actually a guy that I'm excited for, comes over from Alcorn State. He's got some size at 6'7". He's able to give you some rebounds. That should be relatively rock solid for the team, but they really don't return much from a season ago. Blake Lander, he was relatively solid over at LIU. Obviously, you've got Jay Lander and now you've got Blake Lander, so that's going to be a nice combination right there, but still, I just don't really see it with this team. Outside of Benoit, you really don't have anyone other than IJ Azima, taller than 6'6" on this roster, so they're going to really struggle down low, and I think that's a rough year for Southern Miss. So, number 13 in my projector finish, going to be going Southern Miss. At number 12, I do have to go with Georgia Southern. Even though they bring back Tyron Moore and Nakavian White, these are two very good things. I just don't necessarily know if this team is going to be able to bust through this year. For Georgia Southern, they've got a lot of, shall we say, injury-prone guys. I hate to throw out that term, but it does feel that way with White last year. 10.5 points. He was able to give out 2.5 assists per game. Was one of the few guys that stayed healthy. Shot in the mid-30s from three-point range. They lose Aaron Banks from within the conference as well. That's going to be hurting them a little bit. Avante Parker is just a little bit of a roll of the dice. Played in just 17 games last season. He's going to be back after 2 years ago. He had things rocking and rolling. He was giving the team 8.5 points, 5.5 rebounds, a steal, a block per game. So that is something, if you're looking for some upside for Georgia Southern, that can be certainly provided, but it just feels like it's a really top-heavy team. Doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth, and Alden Applewhite is a guy that has always been solid, but has never been really a conduit to winning. This dates all the way back to when he was over at Portland. He's a guy that last year over at Murray State was averaging right around about 6 points, 3 rebounds. It shoots 38% from 3 at 6'7", so the overall three-point shooting should be much better with this Georgia Southern team, but this is also a Georgia Southern team that they, over the last few years, have been absolutely wretched on defense. There's a lot of teams out there in the Sun Belt that have been relatively wretched on defense, so I do have to throw that in there, but they're going to need to improve the fact that in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis last year, they were outside the top 180, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to do so. So, number 12, my projector finish, going with Georgia Southern. Georgia State was even more wretched on defense. I do have them at number 11 in my projector finish. Hardy, 323rd in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis, but I do think that Jonas Hayes is a little bit of a better coach than what he's shown through here in the first few seasons, and Georgia State actually brings back some guys, which I think that's going to be good. Jelani Hamilton, a guy that began his career over at Iowa State, is going to be back. 6'6", a little bit of a jitterbug, do-it-all sort of guy that shot 33% from 3, 10.5 points, 3.5 rebounds per game. That's someone who you're able to build around. You also bring back Malachi Brown. Malachi Brown, was he lighting the world on fire for this Georgia State team? No, but at the same time, he was able to give out 3.5 assists per contest. He's able to get other guys involved. That's big. He's a relatively solid three-point shooter as well, at 37% from three-point range last season, so those are nice guys to be able to build around. Now, it feels like a very top-heavy team. They actually bring in Dennis Scott III. He's a relatively well-touted guy. Trey Scott III as well, so they're bringing in a lot of sons of former players. They're going to be able to give you a bit of something. And I do think that London Riley has a little bit of upside. He comes in from Alabama A&M. He should be able to give the team a little bit of pop out there in the backcourt. I remember he was part of an Alabama A&M team that it felt like they were just making hockey-style line changes last season, and for Riley, he was able to average right around 5 points, shot 36% from three-point range, as a little bit of a role player there, so I've got some pop from three-point range. I do think that the defense is going to be improved from a season ago. They are really going to need to have Joa Chappell be able to step up down low because they don't have a ton of size. They did really struggle on the boards last season, so that's a little bit of an issue, but I do think that the backcourt returning pieces are just enough for this team to avoid the complete seller. I do have Georgia State at number 11 in terms of my projector finish. At number 10, I'm going to be going with Coastal Carolina. With Coastal Carolina, they do bring back Rasheed Jones, who was able to give the team double figures. They just need to find that point guard. They didn't have a single guy last year that gave out more than 2.2 assists per contest. Coastal Carolina, a really stinking slow team. Outside the top 320 in terms of total possessions per game, and certainly I think that year number 2 in this regime change is going to be going a little bit better for Justin Gray. I liked what he was able to do over at Western Carolina, and they bring in AJ Dantzler, who he should be able to help out this backcourt. 3.5 assists, 15 points, 4 boards per contest, shot right around 40% from 3 over at Lemoyne, but going from the NEC to the Sun Belt is a very big step up. You bring back Josh Mayo as well. Mayo, hopefully I said that correctly, he was able to give this team some relatively good production at 6'4" as well. Not a guy that's going to completely light you up from 3 at about 32%, but 8.5 points, 3 boards, 2 assists. That's going to be a little bit helpful. And then Andre Mobilia down low, he was able to give this team some relatively good production as well. He was able to put in there about 3 boards, 5 points per contest, dealt with a little bit of injury last year. A clean bill of health, I think, is going to be able to help him out after he was limited to 18 games last season. I do think that there's upside with this team. They were dead last in the country in terms of turnovers forced on a per possession basis. I don't think that they're going to be amazing at generating turnovers. I think that they're going to learn from those mistakes last year and be a little bit better on that front as well, though. So I do think the Coastal Carolina takes strides forward. I've got them at number 10 in terms of my projector finish. At number 9, I'm going to be going with Louisiana. I just don't know. Your number 1 is going to be going for this Louisiana Raging Cajuns team because they've got a lot of unknown. Like, everyone is brand spanking new on this Raging Cajuns team. I do think that there's quite a bit of upside with Quantas White becoming the new coach. He was over at Houston. He was the associate head coach for them. So this is a guy that I think is actually going to be able to bring some rough and tumble to the team right away, and that's a good thing. And you're bringing in Jamarian Keller. He was able to see some starts last year over at Oklahoma State. Not necessarily like an amazing three-point shooter or anything like that, but a guy that was able to put in there like 5 to 6 points per game over at the Big 12 level, was able to hold his own. So that's something that is encouraging for you. Dorian Finster is another guy that began his career over in the Big 12 as well, over at Kansas State. Last year at Sam Houston, who was relatively solid, was limited due to injury, but he was able to put in there 8 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. He's able to pop threes, but not necessarily a guy that's going to light you up from three-point range. And then they bring in a freshman by the name of Joshua Lewis. Many people have him as a top 150 guy, a 6'7" guy that should be able to space out the floor, give you a little bit of rebounding. And then I do like the versatility of Duncan Boom Boom Powell. I think that he's going to be one of the more underrated players in the conference this season. Over at Georgia Tech, he actually put up some really nice numbers during the 2024-25 season. 12.5 points, 5.5 boards. He's able to shoot about 36% from three-point range. The problem is he's put up really good numbers on losing teams like Sacramento State, Georgia Tech, North Carolina, A&T. He seems like he's a little bit of a black hole where the ball comes to him and then the ball does not come out. So that's going to be a bit of a problem for the team. And outside of Powell, you just don't have a ton down low for the team. Kyron Ratliff is a guy that's able to give you a little bit of rebounding as well, but it's never really fully put it together. So I do have some question marks with Louisiana. I do think that there's going to be some strides forward taken. Darius Woodson is another guy that I'm relatively bullish on coming in from North Dakota. So with Louisiana, could use a little bit more three-point shooting in my opinion. I've got them in my projector finish at number 9. This is going to stun a lot of people, but at number 8 of my projector finish, I'm actually going to Arkansas State. I'm picking them towards the middle of the conference just because what makes us think that Ryan Pannone is going to be the exact same as what we saw from Brian Hodgson? And even when Brian Hodgson was there in his 2 years over at Arkansas State, yes, they were tied for first in the conference last season, but they did not win the conference tournament. They did not make the NCAA tournament, and you've got no continuity whatsoever with this roster. Now, they might have the most talented player in this conference, TJ Caldwell. He's coming over from the SEC where he was able to put up some relatively solid numbers. Did not play last year over at Ole Miss. If you look 2 years ago, he was putting in there about 5.5 points per game. He shot 35% from three. He's a guy that I think has a little bit more ability to be able to handle and facilitate than was let on over at Ole Miss. So I think that this guy is a very high upside guy. And then you bring in Matt Heyman. He was very solid over at Stephen F. Austin. Nice double-figure score. And then Chandler Jackson, we all know about his work over at Florida State. Guy that stands right around about 6'5", was able to see some very, very meaningful minutes for them last season. Was able to supply the team within that neighborhood about 6.5 points. Was able to dole out 2 assists per game. 3-point shooting 2 years ago, actually his freshman year, 37.5% from three. Fell down to 15% last year. I do think that's going to be much better than 15%. I think that was a little bit of bad circumstance in general, but I do have a lot of question marks with this team with regards to what you're going to get in the low post play as well. You really don't have a lot of Division I experience for guys that stand north of 6'6" or so. You've got Jackson Ellingsworth who comes in from UT Arlington. You didn't necessarily see massive minutes for them. I remember he was over at East Carolina and never saw the floor for them. And then you've got Elliton Kura, hopefully I said that correct, from Lindenwood. He did not really put up a whole heck of a lot when he was over at Lindenwood either. So I've got some question marks down low with this team. It feels like it's a team with a lot of upside, but they're probably going to need to have TJ Caldwell along Chandler Jones, one of those two guys, really figure it out at the point guard spot. I just don't know if these pieces all fit together. So I've got Arkansas State at number 8 in terms of my projector finish, as stunning as that's going to be to a lot of people, because I think Bart Torvik has his team rated number 1 in the conference, but I do think that the chemistry is just not there. I set them at number 8 here. At number 7, I'm going to be going with Appalachian State. I just feel like I can bank on Dustin Kern being able to put out there a good product, even though there are going to be a lot of moving pieces for this team. Alonzo Dodd is your main returner from a season ago, but should pair up very well with the fact that you bring in Aaron Banks. He was over at Georgia Southern last year, 9.5 point per game scorer. And Kassan Jennings, he was for South Florida and Kennesaw State last few seasons. He was a part of that old Abdul Rahim tree, which rest in peace to him, but he was a starter last year for South Florida. That was relatively solid. Nearly 2 assists, 7 points per contest. He only shot about 32% from three. Previous 2 years at Kennesaw State at a lower level was shooting more like 38% from three-point range. So I do think that there's a lot of upside with regards to his outside shooting. With Banks, he's not a guy that's necessarily going to continue to go into microwave mode from three-point range or anything like that, but I also do believe that there's a little bit of potential down low. You've got KJ Vassar, who's also going to be able to help out that backcourt a little little bit, but Chad Moody is a guy that I think is going to be able to help hold it down. He stands right around about 6'7", 6'8", with Appalachian State. When this team has really been effective, they've had very, very good big men. You take a look at what they did 2 seasons ago when they won 25-plus games. That was really the hallmark from A&M. Chad Moody was right around 6'8", giving the team about 6 boards, 10.5 points per contest, put in there nearly 2 blocks per contest. I don't know if he's going to be able to quite give you that sort of production, but I do think that he's a very athletic player that has quite a bit of upside. Luke Wilson, no relation to the Wilsons that play on screen. He's a returning guy from Appalachian State a season ago that I think is going to be able to give you some relatively good minutes as well, and I do think that this team has some relatively solid depth. They always play that nice, slow, controlled style, and I think that that's going to lead them to the middle of the conference. So I do have Appalachian State in my projector finish at number 7. At number 6, I'm going to be going Texas State. I really like the upside gambler guys for this team because with Mark Drone, he only played 10 games last season, but you can tell that Mark Drone was giving this team a little bit of a different dimension on offense. Texas State really took off with their three-point shooting last year. They were a top 55 team in all of college basketball. With regards to their three-point shooting percentage, Drone only shot about 31% from 3, but I remember he was a highly touted JUCO guy that does a nice job in terms of having a nose for the ball. He and Caden Gums both gave you an assist, a steal and a half per contest. Gums is back. He shot 37% from 3. He was able to supply the team with about 11 points per contest last season. So these are two guys I think are going to work harmoniously in the backcourt. And then I like the fact that you've got Mekhi Willis and Jalen Bolden, two guys that were a part of the same team in the Sun Belt in Louisiana Monroe coming on over. It's always good when you've got this. And Willis stands right around 6'9", and he should be able to give the team a little bit more rough and tumble down low. And that's something that was missing from Texas State a little bit more last season with Willis, 7.5 rebounds, 10.5 points per contest, and shot 36% from three-point range. So I really like his upside for this team. It is a Texas State team where I do worry a little bit about the just overall depth of this team, but Cameron Simpson is a under-the-radar freshman that I think at 6'7" could be able to provide this team with a little bit of versatility. And then Tay Knox, I think, is your upside guy here. He was able to, over at Western Illinois last year, provide the team with a little bit over 5 rebounds per game. Really not a guy that's going to give you too much on the offensive side of things, but was blocking nearly a shot and a half per contest as well. I think that that's going to shore up a Texas State team that they needed a little bit more down low. I feel like in the transfer portal, they got a little bit more down low. So in my projector or finish, I'm going to be going Texas State at number 6. At number 5, I'm going with Marshall. With Marshall, they bring in figuratively and literally the biggest transfer in the conference. Matthew Von Coleman, who stands 7'4", was an absolute animal over at Elon. And that's big because you've had for Marshall Obiana Onchile Killian the last few years be able to give that team multiple blocks per contest, really good versatility, and Von Coleman at 7'4" is not going to step out there and really pop it from three-point range or anything like that, but I mean, this is a man that was able to, over at Elon last year, provide 2.3 blocks, 8 rebounds per game. He's going to bring the defense for a team coached by Cornelius Jackson. That was really their hallmark. And with Marshall last year, what really stood out to me is that the backcourt play was terrible at the beginning part of the season, but the guys like Jalen Spear, Dezane Mingo really took off towards the back half of the season. Now he's going to need to do it with a completely new backcourt, but I do have some faith in someone like a Kalen Hornbeek being able to do so. Wilson Dubinsky is going to be coming in as well. These are two guys I think are going to be able to step in right away, and I do think that they're going to be able to have some production for Dubinsky. He comes on over after he was over at South Carolina State last season, and he had himself a really nice year over at South Carolina State where they were utilizing hockey-style line changes. There really wasn't a lot of consistency, but he was still able to give that team a nice spark from three-point range, shooting over 44% from the outside. And then with Hollenbeck, he comes on over from the non-Division I level. He was at the junior college ranks. He was able to put up some relatively good numbers there. If I'm not mistaken, he played a little bit of basketball over there at Canada as well. A guy that's fully capable of being able to light it up from three-point range. He is able to give you a little bit of facilitation as well, but they're probably going to be looking to Kai Spears to be able to step it up a little bit more at that point guard spot, be able to give this team a little bit more facilitation, as that's really going to be the biggest question mark for this Marshall team. And I do think that with Spears, after he was not necessarily a guy that was utilized overly much last season, he was very sparingly used, but I believe that he's of relation to Jalen Spear, who really stepped out towards the back half of the season last year. I think that he's going to be able to blossom. And then you also have Ryan Nutter, who was a part-time starter last season, limited to just 22 games, not too much of a scorer, but showed in his time that he was able to get as a starter, that he was able to facilitate. I do think that Marshall is going to have a really good low post play once again, and I think that that's going to get them towards the top of the conference. I've got Marshall at number 5 in terms of my projected or finish. At number 4, I do go with Troy. Now, Troy, they are going to be returning quite a few pieces from a season ago. Bringing back Thomas Dowd, I think, is very big because for Dowd, he was able to give that team in the neighborhood about 10 or so points per contest, 7 rebounds per game. He was a part of a defense that was just so amazing in terms of generating turnovers. But Tatum Conaway was, in my opinion, perhaps the most impactful player for any team in that conference. 14 points, 5 assists, 3 steals per contest. Everything ran through him. And this was a bunch that shot 29.7% from three-point range last year. That was a bottom 20 mark in all of college basketball. They do need to improve that a little bit, and I feel like Troy actually did a solid job in the transfer portal of being able to address some of those issues. Bringing in a guy like a Corbin Green, who's able to give you a little bit of spark from the outside. He was playing over at Robert Morris for a little bit of time. He should be able to help out quite a bit. Cooper Campbell is a guy that was last year a guy that was a little bit more of an ancillary piece, but he shot 35% from 3. He's one of the main guys that's able to actually shoot it from 3 that returns, and I think that that's big that they kept him in-house as well. And then Jarrell Bellamy. I think that this guy is going to be able to take off as well. This team, I think, is going to be built a little bit more down low because last year they were built around being able to generate turnovers, and I just don't know if that's going to be able to win out this season for this team because you do lose the likes of a Miles Rigsby in the backcourt as well, and that's going to be hurting them quite a bit. But I do think that having the 6'7", little bit of a combo player in Victor Valdez is going to be able to help out quite a bit as well. He returns after he gave the team about 4.5 points. He's able to give out multiple assists per game as well. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of versatility with Troy. I think that they're going to be a little bit better with their three-point shooting, but I just don't think that that defensive dominance that they had a season ago is quite going to be taking hold, and I do have a few question marks with them duplicating what they did on the glass as well. But I do know that Scott Cross is a rock-solid coach, so I've got Troy at number 4 in terms of my projector finish. At number 3, I'm going to be going James Madison. James Madison does have to replace a lot of pieces from a season ago. Eddie Ricks is a guy that did follow Preston Spradlin on over from Morehead State, and I think that he's really going to be taking out this year. Like last year, he put up 7.5 points, 6.5 rebounds per game. He was the top rebounder. I think that he's going to be all the more dominant this year. You really don't have a ton outside of him returning from a season ago, so it's going to be up to the likes of Cliff Davis and Paul Lewis, 2 6'2" backcourt pieces that are coming in to really be able to restore some order for the team. And Cliff Davis was very rock solid last 2 seasons. He was with 2 different teams, was able to really tear it up in the Southland 2 years ago, and he was over at Northwestern State, and then last year at UT Rio Grande Valley, he did a nice job in terms of having a little bit more facilitation, multiple assists, shot 37.5% from 3-point range, so he's got some nice versatility there. I think that's really up to Paul Lewis, so if he's able to come off of injury because he was limited to 2 games last year over at UT San Antonio, meet me for the Roadrunners, but he saw some very meaningful minutes at Vanderbilt in his first 2 seasons there. You look at him 2 seasons ago out there in the SEC, he was able to put up about 4.5 points per contest. If he's able to really take over the mantle and become a solid point guard for this team, I really think that you're looking at something. And even if he doesn't become that solid point guard, you've got Bradley Douglas coming on over from Georgia Southern. He's able to give you a little bit of facilitation. He was a nice scorer over at Georgia Southern last year. And Justin McBride, I really think, is the X factor. He comes on over from Nevada, began his career actually out of Oklahoma State, 8 points, 4 boards. Not a guy that's going to light you up from 3-point range or anything like that, but really good defender, guy that's going to be able to help out Ricks down low, so the team is going to be solid on the glass, they're going to be solid in the backcourt, and they just have depth. Eli Wilborn is someone that a few seasons ago when he was playing over at St. Francis was a nice 8 to 9 point per game scorer. Last year at Duquesne really just didn't see a lot of playing time. Ike Cornish is someone that was able to have himself a nice season over at Nichols after he began his career over at Maryland, didn't really find it at Ohio either. He's another one of these upside gambler guys. Preston Fowler, I think, is a little bit of an underrated freshman as well, so I see a lot of upside with James Madison. Not really that dominant guy unless if Paul Lewis becomes that, but I think that their overall depth keeps them towards the top of the conference. So I've got James Madison at number 3 in terms of my projector finish. At number 2, I'm going with South Alabama. Just one of the strangest styles that you're ever going to see. They allowed their opponents to take about 26 or so shots from 2-point range last year, and they dared them to shoot threes. Opponents took about 36 shots from 3-point range. Over 57% of field goal attempts were from 3-point range, but if you've heard me talk through this podcast, there's really not a lot of 3-point shooting out there in the Sun Belt. This is actually a perfect style for this conference. You are bringing back a few of the ancillary guys from a season ago. John Broome, no relation to Janai Broome, 5.5 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. He was able to generate a steal and a half per contest. J.J. Wheat was able to generate a steal and a half per game, and this is a team that does a really good job of taking away the ball. They were a top 30 team in terms of turnovers forced on a per possession basis. They play super duper slow. They keep you off the free throw line as well, and They do have to replace a lot of the top guys from a season ago, but this team just knows what they're doing in terms of bringing in the non-D1 guys. Chazzy Harris is going to be the latest of them. He was able to tear it up at the NAIA ranks. Steven Williams is a guy that I think has quite a bit of upside as well. He's another one of those guys that comes on over from the non-Division I level at 6'9". I think that he's going to be able to shore things up down low. And you bring back Randy Brady as well. Randy Brady, last season, he was able to give the team like 19 starts. Wasn't necessarily too much of a scorer, but was able to give out a little bit over 2 assists per contest, shot 40% from three-point range. I think that he's going to step into a bigger role and is going to be able to do a nice job of doing so. This Richie Riley style just really allows these guys to be able to take a nice leap from one year to the next. I think that the ancillary guys that return in Wheat, Broom, and Brady are going to be able to do so, and I do think that the non-D1 guys are going to continue just the tradition unlike any other over at South Alabama, so I've got them at number 2 in my projector of finish, and this is going to surprise a lot of people, but at number 1, I'm going with Old Dominion. Old Dominion did a really good job of being able to maintain talent, and that's something that is so rare in this day and age in college basketball. Being able to bring back a guy like a Robert Davis that was able to supply 15.5 points per game is just so massive for this team. Caleb Swenton-Roger, he was one of the better low post players in this conference last year, 1.8 blocks, 5.5 points, 5 rebounds per game. Sure, you lose Sean Dewar-Gordon, but that was a guy that it felt like he was a little bit of an all-or-nothing player, so I don't think that that's a big loss. And having a clean bill of health for Stephon Walker, missed 13 games last season, but when he was out there, he was supplying about 7 rebounds per game. That is going to be absolutely massive for this team. They weren't over-aggressive in the transfer portal, but bringing in LJ Thomas, I think, is exactly what the doctor ordered. He began his career over at NC State, where he actually saw some solid run over at NC State, no less, and then at Austin Peay, he was really the man last year, putting in there 14 points, 4.5 boards, 4 assists. Really didn't shoot it well from three-point range, but this is an Old Dominion team that they're not really built around three-point shooting. They're built around being able to get second and third chances. They're built around just rough and tumble defense. I think that he's going to be able to fit that bill. They bring in a guy in Drew McKenna as well, who I think that this is one of those transfers that sort of went under the radar. I think that he's going to be able to step in. He's going to be able to do a good job right away. Began his career over at Georgetown. Really could never find his sea legs there. And then Jordan Battle. He is certainly going to fight for the team after he was over at Coastal Carolina last year, supplying the team with 13 points, 4 boards, 2 assists, shot over 40% from three-point range to be able to solve that puzzle that Old Dominion had of being able to launch it from three-point range. I think that Old Dominion takes that big stride forward under Mike Jones. You ask who? And I say Mike Jones, the coach that I think is going to lead his team to a conference title. So number 1 in my projector of finish, I've got Old Dominion, and that'll wrap things up for the Sun Belt Conference Preview Edition right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. A big thanks to Blake Lovell. He does such great work over at Southeastern 16. He joined me in the last segment. If you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of 2 ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. Other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via the 5-star review. I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I'll be back with you guys once again tomorrow. Thank you.